Assalamu alaikum. My name is Iman, and I'm a member of American Muslims for Palestine's Bay Area chapter. On behalf of American Muslims for Palestine's California family, from San Diego to the Bay Area, I'm happy to welcome everyone watching from California and all over the country to this month's webinar, Palestinian Women, A History of Resistance. As a Palestinian American woman myself, I'm very excited and honored to be moderating today's event. In light of March being International Women's History Month, we felt it pertinent to dedicate time to focus on some contributions of women in the history of Palestinian resistance and the fight for Palestinian rights. Due to the influences of the occupation and the predominantly patriarchal framework of our world, it's easy for many to subconsciously and sometimes actively overlook and underplay the actions and efforts of women for the Palestinian cause. And when thinking about Palestinian leaders, advocates, and activists, it's far too easy to conjure up images of prominent men. And while there are many influential male figures, historically, Palestinian women have also been at the forefronts of the Palestinian resistance. For example, Palestinian women's activism can be traced back to at least 1921, with the foundation of the Palestinian Women's Union, which led demonstrations against the Balfour Declaration. And Palestinian women continue to fight for freedom from all Israeli oppression, regardless of where they are and the conditions they live under. As citizens of Israel, they struggle for equality. And living under Israeli military occupation, they organize against settler colonialism. As refugees, they advocate for their right of return to Palestine. And living in the diaspora all over the world, Palestinian women continue to resist in the global struggle to free Palestine from Israel's apartheid policies. Today, I'm honored to be hosting three distinguished Palestinian women who will each share with us pertinent ways in which Palestinian women have played integral roles in this history of resistance. Our speakers include Amani Barakat, Huwaida Arraf, and Zarefah Baroud. A few housekeeping items before I introduce our speakers. I just want to let everybody know, if you're watching on YouTube or on AMP's Facebook platforms, if you have any questions for our speakers throughout today's event, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll be having someone monitoring your questions as they come in so that they can be responded to during the Q&A portion at the end of our event. And so with that, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker will be Amani Barakat. And Amani hails from Haifa and Jerusalem and now lives in Southern California. Amani is widely known among the Palestinian American community, and she's always found in the front of any public action. She's served several nonprofit organizations advocating for Palestinian freedom and is currently the board chair of Al-Auda, the national coalition advocating for the right to return of all Palestinians living in diaspora. Amani will be speaking to us today on the subject of Palestinian women as the custodians of the Palestinian story, and about grandchildren inheriting the story of displacement from their grandmothers and their right to resist, reclaim, and return. And with that, Amani, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Iman Habibti. I appreciate it. Salam, everyone. It is great to be here with you all this evening. And thank you, AMP, for having me and organizing this event. Palestinian women in resistance have been and continue to be an integral part of the struggle against the ongoing colonization of Palestine. From strategizing and actively orchestrating popular resistance movement to shaping the political discourse throughout each key milestone in our history. This includes the 1936 revolution, the genocide of 1948, the war of 1967, the first intifada in 1987, the second intifada in 2000, and the popular resistance in shaping and leading the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement in 2005 until today. Their participation in the national struggle began with the emergence of the Palestinian cause toward the end of the 19th century, when the first Jewish colonies were built. The first remarkable female political activity was in the town of Afula in 1893, when women demonstrated against the construction of a new Jewish settlement following the killing of 9 Palestinian women in the 1929 Western Wall riots in Jerusalem. The first Arab Women's Association was formed, as well as the Arab Women's Union in October 1929. These unions embarked on several economic, social, cultural, and national efforts, such as planning and organizing demonstrations and writing letters to Arab leaders to support Palestinians. In their active resistance against the British Mandate and Zionism, Palestinian women were not confined to their supportive relationships with a man as a wife, a daughter, or a sister. These women bore significant responsibility for sustaining armed resistance, primarily undertaken by men. They traded and sold their jewelry for rifles. They supplied food, arms, and information to the fighters. Excuse me. The First Intifada ushered in a grassroots popular resistance to the violence of the Israeli occupation. Women demonstrated with men in large protest. A fearless and brave community of women activists took a whole part in the movement, building self-sufficiency for Palestinians under Israeli occupation and collectively blazing a trail of resistance. Palestinian women have transcended all traditional barriers and have been civically engaged in all forms of resistance. They helped preserve the national identity, uniting their dispersed families, clinging to the memory of Palestinians raised by refugee families who never saw Palestine. Beyond that, beyond being Palestinian women, being a Palestinian woman means life, present, past, and future. We are the storytellers, the custodians of our history, the shapers of our culture, the accelerators and proliferators of our resilience. We do this by leveraging every aspect of our culture, whether through oral history, embroidery art, or cuisine. We do this to protect our existence, because our people's mere existence is resistance. As storytellers, we are defining our Palestinian identity and contributing to our memory and resistance. Our determination as mothers in preserving our culture has been one of the most effective tools in our struggle for liberation. No doubt, our people have struggled generation after generation to cement our identity. We've inherited values and tradition from our parents and grandparents. The love and connection we have for our land and people, the guilt many of us carry, and the pain we continue to endure from living in exile are rooted in how we are raising our children and grandchildren. Forgive me, my throat is bothering me a bit. It is genuinely fascinating to see the length in which we take to preserve and celebrate our traditions. Just take a look at how we plan our children's weddings or choose their names. Tell me how many Nadals or Jihads or Tha'ers you have in your families. Look at how we decorate our homes or how we proudly share ma'lube or ma'mul with our neighbors and friends. And not to forget the gardening traditions that many of us are proud to continue, like planting olive trees, citrus trees, grapevine, or even za'atar. While we intentionally expose our children and traditions, while we intentionally expose our culture and traditions to our children, please make no mistake, it is also a lifestyle that breathes breathes fluidity to our homes. It is not a formal class we teach our kids, but our way of living and celebrating life as our parents showed us through their examples. But as much as we like to talk about our brave women who face adversity with resilience, we also must acknowledge the pain and trauma and the hardships women endure from the daily challenges and humiliation of occupation and dispossession. They are the mothers and grandmothers who carry the pain of lost children and lost homes. They are our courageous political prisoners in the Israeli jails. They are the ones standing up to their oppressors at the risk of imprisonment and death. They are the women who live their lives with no certainty that the child they sent to school will return to them. They are the women who sleep fully clothed in case they were evacuated in the middle of the night because their homes will be demolished. On a personal note, my heart aches every time I think of my mother and the pain she carried quietly in her heart throughout her whole life. You see, my mother was 3 years old when my grandfather was martyred in Jerusalem in 1948. My grandmother, who had 11 children beside her, went into a deep depression. My mother was placed in Hind al-Husseini's orphanage, Dar al-Tifel, to alleviate some of the pressure on my grandmother. She was there for a few years. Then she went home and shortly after took off with her brother to Egypt to pursue her higher education. Right after she finished, she got a teaching job in Bahrain. Living alone without any family wasn't easy, but the joy of helping her mother and her two younger siblings eased her hardship a bit from what she told me. In the summer of 1967, she visited her brother in Kuwait. There, she was introduced to my father. The 1967 war started, and shortly after, they got married. A year later, I was born, and in 1969, sadly, she lost her mother. My mom, Allah yarhamha, was a beautiful woman in every sense, loving and oh so kind. But she had this sadness about her that I could never explain. For years, we lived with it and accepted it because we did not know any better. But one thing we knew for sure was how much she loved and missed her siblings. I recall traveling to Jerusalem a few times when I was young, and the happiness I used to see on her face during these visits was simply unmatched. In 1983, my father decided to move us to the States. Although my mother was on board with the idea, she was sad to move yet again to another foreign country with no family. In the States, and years later, after repeatedly asking my mother about her history and our family in Palestine, I learned she was placed in an orphanage. It was difficult for her to open up and talk about what it meant to grow up without a father and away from her mother and sibling, whom she loved dearly. Although I felt such sadness for the pain and suffering she carried quietly in her heart all these years, I realized for the first time how strong and resilient she is. But what I learned later is that not only my mother's story is not unique, but sadly, many women suffered even worse. Whether it is my mother or her mother, Palestinian women have always and continue to craft the blueprint for our resilience and steadfastness. I sincerely believe this to be true. And I will close with a quote from our poet Mahmoud Darwish, who said, "Mother, I will not name you a woman. I will name you everything." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amani, for sharing with us, not the story of your mother, Allah yarhamha, and how it was so impactful for your family, and how there's so many other Palestinian families who've gone through the same experience, and also for really highlighting the way in which You mentioned like small acts of ingraining that Palestinian identity in future generations, whether it's through culture or clothing or names or planting like things in a garden. I think it's often easy to overlook those things that we may have grown up with. So, you know, inherently just like, oh, this is what our family does, but it's really more than that. It's really an act of resistance and cultural preservation in a way. So thank you so much for highlighting that. And with that, we're gonna go next to Zarefah, who will also be talking to us about the Palestinian female experience through lens of stories and analysis. And Zarefah is currently working as the Media and Communications Coordinator for American Muslims for Palestine. She did her undergrad in Media and Communication Studies and completed her master's program in Policy Studies and will be starting her PhD program this fall, inshallah. Zarefah writes frequently and has also produced a documentary film about her family's history in Gaza and the displacement of Palestinians. Zarefah, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm so honored to be amongst these incredible women and all of them that I look up to. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak today and to shed some light on the experience of Palestinian female prisoners. Like what Amani said, the responsibilities of women in our society and Palestinian communities is so heavy. The burden that they bear is so heavy. They're not only expected to maintain the family structure, which then informs and determines the structure of the greater society, the politics, the values, the national consciousness of the next generation, but they're also expected to be this light of hope, and they're expected to produce happiness and strength within their family and within Palestine as a whole, and they do so. That really a task that seems impossible on the outside looking in. A feminist vigor has existed, like was said before, has existed amongst Palestinian women since the beginning of the British occupation, or the British Mandate, sorry. They've always been at the forefront of protests and defiance against the occupation. And the difference between them and other mainstream feminist struggles, much like the Palestinian struggle generally, is that they receive a lot less media exposure. And when it comes to Palestinian female prisoners and Palestinian prisoners in general, often we omit them from our own struggles discourse because it's difficult to talk about, and it's messy, and it's controversial sometimes. And I think that regardless of that, we cannot abandon these people, because they have struggled so much more than any of us could ever imagine. Being in this movement, I think we get kind of comfortable, and we need to kind of realize the people that are really fueling our struggle on the ground, that are keeping it alive. But also an important aspect of the role of these women, of Palestinian female prisoners in general, is that their existence in itself negates this Western stereotype of the passive, or the silent, or the defenseless Arab or Muslim woman. And it also completely calls out Israel's contradictions of being of their liberal persona of being this haven for women and the LGBTQ community in the Middle East, and they're the only place that people can go to be safe. When in reality, Israel employs gendered violence against Palestinian women, particularly Palestinian female prisoners, on a daily basis, and actively tries to diminish their leadership qualities by threatening them based on their gender quite often. So currently there's about 36 women in Israeli prisons or detention centers today. It doesn't sound like a lot in comparison to, for example, there's over 100 Palestinian children right now in Israeli prisons, over 4,000 political prisoners. However, 11 of these women are mothers, and their daughters, and their school teachers, and they're components to a society that are irreplaceable. And so even though it's 36, and that might not sound like a massive number, over the past 50 years, it's an estimated 10,000 women have been arrested and imprisoned by Israel. And because of them being women, Israel, like I said, employs gendered violence against them, especially in the case of interrogation, the nature of the arrest, and their general experience in detention or prison. So past the typical conditions that you would expect in an Israeli prison, like the arbitrary use of solitary confinement, physical abuse and threats, and general medical negligence, Palestinian women are Palestinian women are typically held in prisons such as Hasharon and Daman prisons, which completely lack gender-sensitive policy. So, for example, the threat of medical negligence for a regular prisoner could look more dangerous for a female prisoner. That means no access to female health treatment, feminine hygiene products, and also the denial of prenatal treatment for pregnant detainees or prisoners. Also, Israel systematically denies family visits to women with young children, breaking that bond between the mother and her child from an early age. And while they still endure that typical abuse and the brutal conditions of Israeli prisons, they have to endure this other type of violence as well. If for example, if a female prisoner is a security prisoner, if she was accused of being part of an illegal organization, if she was protesting and that's why she was arrested or detained, that means that she is denied her rights to family visits, to legal counsel, to phone calls even, are completely thrown out the window. They don't receive those rights. But even if they do, if they're not a security prisoner per se, Israel still requires family members that want to go visit them in Israel to apply for a travel permit and then wait months. So children can be removed from their mothers for months on end. And some of these women, I think it's 10 women that are currently in prison, have a sentence of at least 10 years. So completely extracting these women, especially mothers, from their society, from their community, and from their families. And to talk again about the way that femininity is used against Palestinian female prisoners detained by Israel, is interrogation is often accompanied by forced stripping, sexually explicit verbal abuse, and threats of rape. And so they have to endure a different type of violence, though it's not more or less violent necessarily than the threats against men or children, but it's a different type of violence. It's really rarely talked about, again, because it's uncomfortable sometimes to talk about, but it's something that real women, our fighters, our resistors are living today. They have to go through these things every single day, and we can't be too uncomfortable to speak about that because they're living it. Also, something that I found really interesting is that Israel symbolically will hire and recruit female Israeli soldiers and prison administrators to detain and accompany women during their transfers from either like interrogation centers to detention centers, or detention centers to prisons, or prison to prison, to show like, oh, we're accommodating to Muslim women, or we're accommodating to women that have this expectation in their culture. But in reality, a study actually by an Israeli NGO called Breaking the Silence found in this report that they published in 2010 that the violence at the hands of Israeli female soldiers actually surpasses the violence of their male counterparts towards Palestinian women and men. And the report the report through testimonies found that this was because Israeli female soldiers use these violent tactics or overly violent tactics against Palestinian women in order to gain respect from their male counterparts. That I thought that was incredibly interesting. It kind of shows that this idea of women's rights it's not as simple as we think it is. A lot of people like to talk about, we need to fight for women to be treated equally and these military apparatuses, but really they're just only harming more women. So I think that that's something really interesting to look at. So the impact, I guess I was trying to think about what would the impact be of these women being removed from their societies? What does it mean when a Palestinian mother or daughter or wife is arrested or detained? It doesn't only leave the family in complete limbo, but it traumatizes and emasculates the entire family and even their community. Israeli forces and intelligence are known to deliberately use family against one another as a way to control and punish the entire family or the community. In an article that was actually written by Rosemary Saig, I think is how you pronounce her name, she estimated that 3 times as many women have been tortured or threatened or Palestinian women have been tortured or threatened to put pressure on husbands, brothers, or sons because of Israel's employment of what she calls love, fear, shame, and protectiveness, which is used to shock and break down resistance. So they use these values in Palestinian or Muslim societies of honor, of, like she said, of shame, and these things to desecrate the foundation of the Palestinian family by abusing and threatening and torturing Palestinian women. And they as Rosemary, they face the brunt of that because of them being women. Also, another way that women and parents in general are kind of used against one another in this dynamic that Israel facilitates is that that mothers are often, and as well as fathers, are indicted for the suspected crimes of their children as well. Like if their child has been accused of being in resistance, the mother can be tried and indicted for teaching their child how to be a terrorist. And so it's really toxic the way that they create this they try to create this feud within a family, and the rate of Palestinians in general being imprisoned is so high that it's like a virus in Palestinian society that has been implanted by Israel. I have been told that I only have a little bit of time left, so I would like to quickly read a testimony from a Palestinian prisoner from Gaza. And it's from a book called These Chains Will Be Broken, Palestinian Stories of Struggle and Defiance in Israeli Prisons. It's written by my dad, but that doesn't change the fact that it's a very good book. This chapter is called Hanan is Tenderness, and it's the testimony of a prisoner named Wafat, who basically became friends with this little cat that entered her cell one day. So I'm going to try not to cry while I read this because it's really hard not to. My darling Hanan was very, very beautiful. I adopted her. I looked after her, groomed her, and shared my food with her. When the prison administration would cut down the rations to punish me, I would give it all to Hanan, because the love and warmth I received from her far exceeded whatever love I could have given her. I used to talk to her for hours as a close friend. I know that she felt deep sadness for my adversity and truly felt my suffering. And whenever she winced, I felt that she was saying, "Yes, I hear you and I feel your pain." My cell was underground. At first, I visited with Hanan in the prison's concrete courtyard. I built her a little house using discarded cardboard. I snuck food out of the cell whenever I went to Al Fora and would place it inside her house. That is how I was able to familiarize myself with her and her new place. When our friendship became stronger, she would come looking for me in my cell. I would save her the only piece of chicken I received with my meal every Friday, because Hanan liked meat. She would sense my presence at the door of my cell and come running. When she drew closer, I would stick my hand out of the little opening of my cell door to caress her. I would peer out of the door and look into her eyes and talk to her for a long time. Sorry. I told her many a time that I was lonely and that the walls of my cell were closing in on me. I told her that I was a prisoner with so much pain and no one could understand my suffering. I told her how much I missed visiting my family, who were forbidden from seeing me for years. I told her how I wasn't justly treated and that this was not my place in this world. She would look at me and hang on every word as if she understood my English. One day I asked the prison guard for a cup of tea and I was denied having access to any food or drink in my cell. I was surprised when she agreed. She asked me to extend my hand from the little trapdoor to fetch the cup. When I did, she poured boiling water all over my hand, leaving me with third-degree burns that continue to cause me tremendous pain to this day. I still hope that will help me treat my unhealed wounds. On that day, I screamed in pain for hours and no one came to my rescue except for Hanan. She ran to my door and she wept. We cried together for a long time. Sometime later, I realized Hanan was pregnant. I reinforced her cardboard home and covered the floor with one of my 2 dresses that I was allowed to keep in my cell. I used my favorite white dress. I cut it into small pieces and lined the floor with it. Then I moved the whole box beside the portable toilet in the courtyard for extra safety. When she finally gave birth, I increased the portions of food and water for her and her kittens. But the guards found out. They told me this is unacceptable and disgusting. I wept in front of them. I cried, "Please don't take my friend away. Please don't separate us." I felt that they thoroughly enjoyed seeing me in this desperate condition. To further my torment, they poisoned Hanan and her babies. I watched the little kitten as they were in pain. I sat beside them, sobbing and imploring God for mercy. The guards laughed and stomped on them as they screamed in agony. A large guard placed his heavy boot on Hanan's face and crushed it. To this day, I still hear their voices. I am constantly visited by the horrific images of the pool of blood and the bodies of my best friend and her babies scattered across the prison yard. Hanan was the only hope that kept me strong, and the Israelis crushed it without mercy. After the death of Hanan and her little ones, I launched an open hunger strike. I did not have any demands. It was the only human thing I could do to rebel against their inhumanity. Israelis are so blinded by hate, to the point that their hearts have grown so callous. What had Hanan done to deserve such suffering? Her only crime is that she had given a ray of hope to a lonely prisoner longing for her freedom. Hanan will live in my heart for as long as I breathe. I'm sorry, that took a little while, but Wafat was sentenced to 12 years in Israeli prison and has to live with that torture. So I think it's so important that we're telling their stories and not forgetting about them. All right, thanks.
Thank you so much, Zarefah, for sharing that really powerful testimony and really highlighting the horrific experiences of, the Palestinian women who are being held in these prisons. Um, I think that testimony, I mean, no need to apologize for it being long, because I think it really shed light on like the merciless experiences that they go through. So I think I'm going to just take a breath before introducing our next speaker. It's with this conversation, it's really important for us to be taking the time to empower and uplift and highlight the experiences of Palestinian women. And it can be uncomfortable to talk about some of the things like repression and oppression that they go through, but it's still so valuable to do that. So thank you for highlighting that in this venue. So our next speaker will also be talking about the role of Palestinian women in political organizing, the various forms of repression used against Palestinian women, and the lack of accountability that has enabled Israel to continue its violent settler colonial project. I think she'll also be touching upon the significance of the recent ICC decision. And so our next speaker will be Huwaida. And Huwaida was born in the US from Palestinian origins. She is a human rights activist, lawyer, and co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement, which is a Palestinian-led movement utilizing nonviolent direct action to confront and challenge Israel's illegal and inhumane policies in the occupied Palestinian territory. She was the chair of the Free Gaza movement at the organization behind the Gaza Freedom Flotillas, and she was aboard the 2008 Free Gaza boats, as well as the 2010 flotilla that was raided by Israeli commandos. So with that brief introduction, I turn it over to Huwaida.
Thank you so much, Iman. Let me also say what an honor it is to be in this space with Amani, a good friend who I love and adore, with you, Iman, and my first time also being and listening to Zarefah, a young Palestinian who just makes me so proud as an older Palestinian. And I see what our youth can do, in the fact that they do carry our stories and our passion, and they are the assurance that Palestine will live on, to Israel's dismay. So we heard some beautiful and very painful, yet also inspiring words about the integral role of Palestinian women in struggle for liberation. And like you noted, I think, Iman, in your introduction, it really was since the beginning of the 20th century that Palestinian women's activism has been influenced by and by its relation to and identification with our national liberation struggle. And it was before Israel was founded. And that was because when we were under the Ottoman rule, at the time of World War I, Palestinians really believed that we were promised our freedom. And some of you might know this history, in a series of letters exchanged, Hussein McMahon correspondence, basically, we believe the Arabs were believed that they were promised independence in exchange for siding with the Allied powers against the Ottomans, and we did, and that's not what happened. Obviously, then came the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which France and Britain divided the Arab regions between them, which was followed also then by the Balfour Declaration. After World War I, Britain came to militarily occupy Palestine, and in 1920 they changed that military occupation into like a civilian rule. That was a British mandate. And in the San Remo conference in 1920, it was reaffirmed that Palestinians, the Arabs in general, were not going to get their freedom. And almost immediately, Palestinian women started organizing. You did mention Iman, and also Amani mentioned the establishment in 1921. I mean, almost just months after the first Palestinian Arab Women's Union, and that was for the very purpose of contributing to the national aims of our resistance. And so it's talked about the central role that they had in assisting rebels, in getting our story out, and in organizing against the Balfour Declaration and against the British Mandate in general. One of the largest women's gathering in Palestine took place shortly after that. It was in Jerusalem in 1929. And that was following the Al-Buraq uprisings, which Palestinian women also took to the streets in large numbers and participated in all forms of the resistance. And only 2 months after the Al-Buraq uprisings, in which 9 Palestinian women were martyred amongst over 100 Palestinian men, only 2 months later, they organized the largest women's conference gathering in Palestine in late October 1929. About 300 women estimated took part in that. And the goal was to, or what they agreed to at that conference was, they had some very clear guidelines. Number one, boycotting British products. Number two, they were going to establish a media center to inform the world of what was happening in Palestine. And number three, they were going to continue to organize protests. And they concluded that that conference with a delegation of women that set out to meet with the British High Commissioner and present them with their demands, which included the cancellation of the Balfour Declaration and halting Jewish immigration to Palestine. And they also wanted at the time the replacement of the Attorney General, because he was really known for being a Zionist and very prejudiced against the Palestinians of the land. And that kind of resistance and organizing continued. You had in general the Palestinian women in the cities that were more took to collecting donations from martyrs' families and organizing protest marches, writing petitions, trying to get media stories out. And in the villages, women were more connected to like resistance work on the ground, building roadblocks and trenches and transporting food, supplies, and weapons to the fighters in the mountains. And what was interesting about that too is that they had a very, they had a consciousness and a strong Christian and Muslim solidarity. For example, in April 1933, Palestinian women from all over Palestine, they marched to Jerusalem's holy site to protest Allenby's visit. And a Palestinian Muslim woman, Tarab Abdel Hadi, she marched to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and addressed the people that were gathered there. And the Christian Palestinian, Matial Mughannam, she marched towards the mosque and the Dome of the Rock and addressed those present there. And they both gave fiery speeches and warned against like Zionist immigration and the plan to replace the indigenous people of the land with these Zionist colonists. And again, this continued during the 1936 revolution. They also had a very significant role. And I'm just going to kind of gloss over this because there's so much to talk about here. But the resistance continued also after 1948 and in the massacres leading up to 1948. For example, the Geriacene Massacre. One young woman, Hayat al-Balbisi, 18 years old, she was a Red Cross volunteer. She was actually in Jerusalem on the day of the massacre. But when she heard of what was happening and of the attack on Geriacene, she rushed to Geriacene, and being a Red Cross volunteer, she took over a school, put a Red Cross sign at the door and sheltered children inside, and felt that, Israelis wouldn't attack, being that this a Red Cross sign was at the door. But that didn't stop them, and she was shot dead by Israeli forces, or Zionist forces. Israel had not yet been established, for helping injured Palestinians. The 50 plus children, about 55 children that survived the Geriacene massacre, some of you know the story. They were paraded around different villages and then dumped in Jerusalem, where they were found by Hind al-Husseini, who ended up establishing Dar al-Tifl al-Arabi that Amani talked about. Her mother spent some time there. These are just some of the names of the women, and through history we know of others, from those that established social services to fighters like Dalal al-Mughrabi, Shadan Abu Ghazali, Layla Khalid. In 1987, when the first Intifada broke out, women had a very visible role, from organizing the tax boycotts in the southern area, Bethlehem, Beit Sahur, to establishing women's collectives, to trying to save young Palestinian boys and men from being arrested. For example, a very widely used tactic is, Israeli forces would just randomly go after Palestinian men and boys in the streets, and women, even if it wasn't their own child, would run after them screaming, and my son, and throw themselves on them to try to wrench them out of the hands of the Israeli soldiers. This kind of, and they also participated in the rock throwing and other forms of organizing, establishing, distributing leaflets, etc. We come to Oslo, unfortunately, brought that kind of collective popular resistance to an end, and even the Palestine Liberation Organization at the time, I say, they traded this national liberation goal for a goal of state building, which was unfortunate. We saw the leadership come from outside, and many of us know what happened from 1993 when we thought we were building a state to 2000. One of the detrimental aspects of Oslo on the ground in Palestine and this building of the Palestinian Authority is that the popular structures that sustained the resistance through the decades, and the height of it being the first Intifada, with these various forms of collective resistance on the ground that took place, that was all deliberately broken down. And now we had a Palestinian Authority that tried to conduct itself as a state, but no real authority. And all of I didn't talk too much about the losses through the years, but significantly, Palestinians suffered significant losses, and we know a lot of them, from exile to all of the Palestinian men, women, and children that we had murdered, Palestinian losing limbs, livelihood through the years, and it continues today. There has been no accountability for this. Palestinians have not had a place where they could hold Israel accountable for what it was doing to them. Israel, the way it has administered the occupation, is really a mild word. We say occupation is only an element of a larger settler colonial project, which was put in place before the establishment of the state, and which Israel has continued to just carry out its plans. And when Palestinians protest, they are repressed, they are arrested, they are tortured in the ways that we heard from Zarefah, and they are killed. And where Palestinian courts cannot try Israelis, Israeli courts are not interested in trying Israeli soldiers, because this is a deliberate policy that is put in place at the highest levels. And even when they try to show the world that they do some investigations, they are usually sham investigations. Sometimes they give a soldier or a settler a few months of community service or a couple of years in jail, and then when the world's not looking, that soldier or that settler gets out again, because and what's not put on trial is really the system at a higher level. And Palestinians have tried then, through the years, of using different mechanisms. Courts around the world, most courts in most jurisdictions around the world have something that's called universal jurisdiction, which countries take the authority really to put on trial the greatest perpetrators of horrendous and heinous crimes against humanity. And we've seen this used against war criminals in other contexts. But when Palestinians have tried to hold Israelis accountable by using the courts of these countries, like Spain, like Belgium, like Germany in recent years, even though these countries have very vibrant universal jurisdiction laws, when Palestinians have tried to use them, the laws were changed to really throw Palestinians' cases out of court. And they were different in each context, but Palestinians, again, were not able to get justice. This, in the past couple of months, we've seen a slight glimmer of hope. And I'll talk a little bit about that, then I'll try to leave the rest to question and answer period. On March 3rd, of this year, the prosecutor Fatou Bensouda of the International Criminal Court announced that she was opening an investigation into the situation in Palestine. This is a long time coming. Since 2009, Palestinians asked the International Criminal Court to take jurisdiction to look into the situation in Palestine, and that was after a brutal, gruesome military assault on Gaza. But after 3 years, the prosecutor at the time said he could not he could not make a decision as to whether the court had jurisdiction over Palestine because Palestine wasn't a state. Of course, shortly thereafter, Palestine did seek statehood in recognition in the UN, and it was granted that. In 2015, the Palestinians in January 2015 basically acceded to the International Criminal Court and then asked the court to look into the situation in Palestine. From then, the Office of the Prosecutor has been looking into the case from 2015 until now, and just recently the case was announced. But some significant things happened in that time. One of the things being that in December 2019, the prosecutor issued her findings saying that she has significant reason to believe that there are crimes, war crimes being committed in Palestine. And she believes that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction, but to kind of have her back on that, she asked the pretrial chamber for a legal opinion on whether the court has jurisdiction. And in February of this year, the court, in a 2-to-1 decision, said that the court does have jurisdiction over the territory, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, and that that the jurisdiction of the court extends there, which is limited. I mean, it's good and bad. Israel tried to fight it by saying, the court will be politicizing and be making political decisions and try to put up all kinds of arguments about why the court did not have jurisdiction. And 2 out of the 3 judges disagreed and, basically gave the prosecutor the green light to go ahead. Now, there are still a lot of political considerations here, and there's a lot of political pressure being placed on the court. So even though an investigation has been opened, which is a positive, there are a couple things that we need to look into or be wary of. One of them is that one of the biggest backers of the court, or some of the biggest backers, let me say, is Western European countries. They are almost all members of the court, and they provide the most financing to the court. And Israel is exerting a lot of pressure on them. And some of them we've been noticing in recent weeks and months have been showing that they are susceptible to that pressure and have issued statements really disagreeing with the decision to proceed on Palestine. The United States under Trump issued an executive order placing sanctions on the court, which is shameful in and of itself. But what's even more shameful is that the Biden administration still has not overturned that executive order. And so we also see pressure from the United States on the court not to pursue this. So it was the right thing to do, but it was also courageous at the same time for Fatou Bensouda to say that we're opening the case now, which mandates that all 123 member states of the court cooperate with the court in its investigation. So we'll see where that goes. But the importance of this, although it's limited, I said the scope is limited to the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, which is significant because a lot of crimes certainly have been and continue to be committed there. But the court does not, as of now or as of this moment, have the authority to address the Palestinian situation as a whole, our refugee issue, the dispossession as a whole, the apartheid nature of what's happening. This could change, but that's not what the court said that they're going to look into for now. But that's not to say that there can't be some developments, I think, in the future. And I'm going to remain optimistic about that. And if you want, I'm sorry, I'm glossing over this. If anyone wants any more details on that, please ask me in the question answer period. But why this is significant is because for over 7 decades, Palestinians have not been able to take their case anywhere to get any justice. And Palestinian, especially women, and maybe I say this more as a mother, but imagine what it's like to not have any semblance of control over your daily life and not being able to provide any measure of safety for your kids, so that when your kids go off to school, you don't know if they're going to come back. If your child needs some kind of treatment, you don't know if you can provide it. And most likely you can't provide it because it is not in your hands, especially when we're talking about Gaza. Gaza, if you were the mother of Aisha Lulu, if you know that name, or if you don't know that name, let me tell you, Aisha Lulu is a 5-year-old little girl living in Gaza in 2019 who was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And she couldn't get treated in Gaza because Israel doesn't allow Gaza to import the equipment that are needed to treat cancer. And so she had to get out. And Al-Maqasid, the Palestinian hospital in Jerusalem, could perform the surgery that she needed and gave her the permit. The Israelis gave Aisha the permit to go get that treatment, but they did not give her parents permits to go with her. Aunts, uncles, all close relatives, all denied permission to go with her until finally some random neighbor got a permission to go with her, which this 5-year-old girl is traumatized, having to go for this major surgery without anyone that she really knows. But she went, and the surgery was successful. But the pain of not having her parents with her began to significantly affect her recovery. And the doctor called her mother in Gaza saying, you or the father find some way to get here because the surgery was successful, but she's deteriorating. She is traumatized and she's deteriorating. And they couldn't get that permit. And within days, unable to speak and crying, Aisha Lulu closed her eyes for the last time. And so if you were her mother, you can't even be with your dying daughter. That's another thing that the occupation has stripped from us, the ability to provide our kids with protection, to tell them that they'll be okay, to tell them I will be there for you. That's something a court really can't give back to you, can't give back all the lives, but at least have some acknowledgement for victims who for over 7 decades have not had acknowledgement of their pain and losses. And this is the significance of this court. Right now, there's another little child in Gaza, 6 weeks old, who has a heart deformity and needs surgery immediately. And the parents are waiting. They're waiting to see if Israel will give her permission if she doesn't die first. Let me end there. I think I've gone over time, but thank you for this space. Thank you for being here with us, and thank you for being in the struggle with us.
No problem at all for going over time. Thank you so much for sharing that powerful, I don't even know, like story and history. I think it was, yeah, I mean, there was a lot of great insights, and I know it was very impactful for me. I'm almost at a loss for words, but thank you for providing that history of the way that Palestinian women have been organizing and involved in the movement from the beginning of the 20th century onward, and then how that leads into the ICC investigations and what that may lead to. I know that the ICC decision is a really hot topic, and I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions about it. So thank you for providing that context. So now we are going to open it up for the Q&A portion of the event. And so if anyone who's watching either on YouTube or Facebook has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll be monitoring it so that we can get your questions answered by our guests today. And while we're waiting for people to take a breath and type out their questions, I personally had a question from listening to you all, and this question is open to all of you or any of you, whoever feels like they want to answer it. So personally, as a Palestinian or as a Palestinian American woman myself, like my background is in language and linguistics and literature. And so a Palestinian woman who's been really influential to me is Fadwa Tuqan, who's like a very prominent Palestinian poet. And I was wondering, for you in your different lines of work or in your experiences with your family or anything like that, who are the Palestinian women who have inspired you or that you'd encourage people to learn more about?
Who wants to go? I can go, I guess. There are many women to choose from. Fadwa Tuqan is a poet that I grew up reading her poetry, and at one point, when I was even 13 and 14, I used to memorize her poetry. I've also been very blessed to be in this space of organizing for Palestine, that I've really met the most amazing women in our movement. I love Diana Bhutto. She comes first to my mind. My friend Ahlam Muhtasib, Dr. Ahlam Muhtasib. I love Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi. I learned so much from her. Suzanne Abul Hawa is someone that I really enjoy reading her books, and someone who I really, feel like, she has always something to say and something that we can learn from. There are many, but I'll leave the space to my other colleagues here.
Thank you for highlighting those, key women who I think are also really contemporary. I think it's important to focus on people who are, currently putting in the work and whose efforts are like taking place in our lifetime, to make sure that we're supporting them. So thank you for highlighting them. I don't know if Zarefah or Huwaida, if anyone else has any input.
The first person that came to my mind wasn't a public figure in any sense, but my grandmother, her name was Zarefah as well. She raised my dad and his family in the Gaza Strip, and survived through a lot. And unfortunately, I never got to meet her because she passed away when my dad was like 13 or 14. But my dad, even though she didn't even have an elementary school education, my dad always tells me that she was the smartest woman that he had ever met. And I think about her all the time, like whatever I do.
Yeah, I love that. And I want to echo all of the names that Amani stated, and also say that, we know some names in history. I named a few of them, and there are so many more. I think the important thing is that there are thousands and thousands of unnamed heroic women and activists and fighters whose names we might never know. But they'll always be a part of us because they are, like Zarefah said, our grandmothers, they're our mothers, our sisters, our friends, our comrades that aren't doing it for a fame or photo or anything, but they're doing it because our lives depend on it and the future of our kids' lives depend on it. And I also want to shout out to my grandmother here, who I didn't know well. She passed away when I was 3 and my parents had immigrated to the United States. But what I hear about her, and this is also kind of the strength of Palestinian women in our village in the Galilee, is it became part of Israel. And our village managed to stay. We weren't ethnically cleansed. The village was not demolished, but my grandfather was a landowner and owned a lot of land. We were farmers, and Israel was, the newly founded state was obviously taking a lot of Palestinian land, confiscating a lot of Palestinian land, and Palestinians lived off that land. So at at one point when it was noted that we were notified, or my grandparents were notified that a big chunk of their land was going to be confiscated by the state, my grandmother, as the story goes, she had 4 kids at this time. My father was the youngest at the time. This was like 1949, 1950. And she marched into the military governor's office at the time. It was in around Akka. And she left all her 4 kids there. And she said, "You're taking away my ability to be able to provide for them. You provide for them." And she left. And he ended up chasing her outside. "Wait, come back and get your kids." And the story goes that's how she saved our land at the time from being confiscated. Of course, many, many years later, Israel continued to take land away. But at the time, she managed to save our land in this way. So I love that story, and I look up to her and all our grandmothers, and again, the thousands of women whose names aren't written in history, but who we owe a debt of gratitude to.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. I mean, I completely agree. I think sometimes, as Amani mentioned in the beginning, the most impactful women are the ones that keep our existence and our stories going, and that so often includes our grandmothers. I know for me personally, my grandmothers are people that I most admire, and I think Siti is watching right now, so grateful to have that continued support. And it looks like y'all did a really amazing job covering your topics, because it seems like the audience is satiated with the content and doesn't have any questions. And so I thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm so honored to be hosting such impactful and influential women in our movement. And before we close out, I just want to make a quick announcement about AMP's annual date boycott. As many of you may or may not know, AMP launched our annual date boycott on March 15th, and it'll be continuing throughout from now until Ramadan. And it's really focused on ensuring that people are, buying ethical dates this Ramadan, because Israel's date industry profits immensely from the exploitation of Palestinian labor and natural resources. And we want to make sure that we are not buying dates that are benefiting from the occupation and, contributing to that. And so you'll see on the screen information about our date boycott and the brands that are that you'll want to look out for. And it's important to share this with your networks, because a lot of times the date boycott has been going on for many years, and it's been really impactful at impacting the number of date exports out of Israel into the US. And so a lot of the brands can be labeled as like Jordan River, or things that ambiguously allude to the West Bank. And so you'll just want to look out for that. And you can learn more, for everyone watching, you can learn more about the date boycott on AMP's website if you go to ampalestine.org/date boycott.
And sorry, yes. Before we close out, can I also then mention something, if we have the time?
Sure.
I wanted to draw attention to a collective that I'm actually very proud to be a part of, and hopefully, I think some people watching here, Amani is also a part of the Palestinian Feminist Collective, which is we recently launched our first public campaign, and it's a pledge. I encourage you all to. I'll try to put the link up. Read the pledge and endorse it and join us. The collective includes about 60 to 70 Palestinian and other Arab women right now, women and feminists who have been in conversation for a while about how to address a lot of the violence that Zarefah spoke about, this gendered violence against Palestinian women that comes from the occupation, for sure, Israel's settler colonial policies, and also from our own societies. Our pledge specifically, so we're intend to address a lot of issues, and we're still in development, but our first pledge is intended to address the various ways in which also Zionism has taken over this space and repressed the expressions of our identity and of our ability to work in solidarity here in the United States. So the feminist collective right now is focused on the United States, and maybe it'll grow more than that, but we are in conversation and connected to certainly Palestinian women's movements in Palestine and other groups that we're connected to around the world. And we have specific asks in this pledge, and what we really, the pledge is called Palestine is a feminist issue. And that's, of course, not to say that it's only a feminist issue, but it is to say that specifically, it's to say that you can't be a feminist without also advocating for Palestinian rights, for Palestinian liberation, because what we see in US spaces is a lot of Palestinian voices, Palestinian women have been attacked, have been silenced, and even have been criminalized for speaking out about Palestine and Palestinian rights. And so what we're trying to do here is trying to call out this Zionist discourse that has occupied Palestinian and feminist spaces in the United States, and saying that there really needs to be truly a form of transnational and intersectional solidarity, and that includes in feminist spaces in the United States. So you can't be a feminist without standing for Palestine's liberation. And so you can find us on Facebook. We have a pledge up, and within the first day or two of the pledge, we've got thousands of endorsements, and they're still coming in, and we'd love everyone that's watching here to endorse. And once you do, and we have your contact information, the collective will be putting out more resources about how we can continue to work together, basically to do this work together. So thank you for allowing me to announce that. It's really an inspiring collective that's long overdue, and trying to, again, create the space where we can have this discussion about all the ways in which Palestinian women have and our bodies have been used for various forms of violence, and specifically by the Zionist colonial enterprise, but also in other ways.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's definitely relevant to the conversation we've had today, and I think it'd be helpful if that link information can be added in the comments of this stream so people can reference it for the future. So afterwards, you can definitely add that for people to reference. And with that, I want to be mindful of all your times. I know, Huwaida, it's pretty late out on the East Coast, and so I want to thank you all again so much for joining us today, and providing us with this really important background on the subject of Palestinian women. I appreciate your time and the powerhouse panel that we had. And so as you can see, just a quick announcement, our next AMP webinar series is posted up for you all to see. It's on March 30th, and it's part of the Palestinian and Black Solidarity initiative by AMP, and so I hope you all can join us on March 30th, inshallah. So with that, I hope everyone has a good night.
Good night. Thank you.